I didn't like it, but it didn't stop me playing on it, I just played the way I played. I play emotionally.
The Beatles were a family. They were four young guys from Liverpool who, against all odds, conquered the world with their music, their charm, and what looked like an unbreakable bond. They were brothers, tied together by a wild ride so unique, so huge, that no one else could ever really get it. But just like any family, especially one stuck under the spotlight of global fame and insane pressure, cracks started to show. By the end of the 1960s, the dream was turning into a mess of lawsuits, business fights, and bitter feelings. Through it all, one person had always been the anchor, the steady heartbeat in the middle of the hurricane: Ringo Starr. He was the easygoing Beatle, the dependable friend, the one who just wanted to play the drums. He was the guy who usually stayed out of the drama, the quiet center of a collapsing universe. That is, until one fateful day. A day when a mission of peace turned into a declaration of war. A day when one of his brothers, a man he'd shared stages and secrets with for a decade, pushed him to a place he'd never been. It was a showdown so explosive, so shocking, that it would lead Ringo to believe his bandmate had gone completely mad. This is the story of the one relationship that pushed Ringo Starr to his absolute breaking point, and the explosive clash that showed the true, heartbreaking depth of the Beatles' divorce. The air in the house was so thick with tension you could cut it with a knife. It was the spring of 1970, and Ringo Starr had driven to his bandmate, Paul McCartney's house, not as a friend, but as a messenger. He was carrying a letter, a formal request from the other Beatles asking Paul to delay the release of his first solo album. It was a business thing, a move to keep it from clashing with the release of the final Beatles album, Let It Be. Ringo, always the peacemaker, figured he was the right man for the job. He thought that Paul, his old pal, couldn't possibly get angry at him. He was wrong, terribly wrong. What happened next wasn't a chat between brothers. It was an explosion. In Ringo's own words, Paul went completely out of control. The man who had written some of the world's most beautiful love songs was now a picture of pure rage, shouting, his face twisted, jabbing his fingers aggressively at Ringo's face. The threats that followed were chilling and direct. "I'll finish. You now," he snarled. "You'll pay." Stunned and shaken, Ringo was ordered to put on his coat and get out. He did exactly as he was told, walking away from the fight not just as a rejected bandmate, but as a man who had just seen the full, ugly fury that had finally torn his family apart. To get how a friendship built on years of good times and shared. History could go so wrong. You have to understand the world the Beatles were living in during their final years. It was a world crumbling under its own weight. The band's long, slow breakup didn't happen overnight. It was a painful process that started long before that day at Paul's house. The first and maybe biggest blow was the death of their manager, Brian Epstein, in 1967. Epstein wasn't just a manager, he was the guy they trusted, their protector, and the glue that held their different personalities together. Without him, the four of them were lost, trying to run their own massive empire. Paul. McCartney, always the workaholic, tried to fill that role. He became the band's unofficial leader, pushing them into projects like Magical Mystery Tour and the sprawling double album that would become known as the White Album. Ringo himself later said that without Paul's drive, the Beatles would have made a lot fewer records. John and Ringo, by their own admission, were more likely to just chill out. But Paul would be the one to call and say, "All right, lads, time we went in." But what once felt like ambition now started to feel like control. During the White Album sessions, the mood got so toxic that Ringo, feeling like an outsider and sick of Paul's constant criticism of his drumming, actually quit the band. He escaped to Sardinia on a boat loaned to him by actor Peter Sellers, only coming back after his bandmates begged him to return and filled the studio with flowers. It was a temporary truce in a war that was only getting started. The Get Back sessions in January 1969, which were later pieced together as the Let It Be album and film, were a new low. Paul had imagined it as a way to get back to their roots and play live together, but the project turned into a filmed record of a band falling apart in real time. The cold, massive Twickenham film studios only made the tension worse. George Harrison, who had been stewing for years over his songs being ignored by the Lennon-McCartney powerhouse, clashed openly with Paul on camera. John Lennon, for his part, was mostly checked out, his focus almost entirely on his relationship with Yoko Ono, whose constant presence created friction for the others. Ringo, once again, was stuck in the middle, the quiet observer watching his family implode. He was the one member who seemed to be on good terms with everyone, the neutral zone in a three-way civil war. He later talked about the weird feeling he had knocking on John's door to say he felt like an outsider, only for John to say, "I thought it was you three who were close." He then went to Paul with the same worry, and Paul said the exact same thing. The four corners of the square weren't connected anymore. Each one felt alone. Each one felt like the others were ganging up on them. Ringo was adrift, a drummer without a band, a brother whose siblings weren't on the same page anymore. This was the landscape of paranoia and mistrust Ringo was walking into on that fateful day he drove to Paul's house. While Ringo was often seen as the one who stayed out of trouble, the fight that blew up between him and Paul didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of a specific chain of events that drove a wedge right between them, turning a business argument into a deeply personal wound. The root of it all was one name: Alan Klein. After Brian Epstein's death, the Beatles company, Apple Corp., was in financial chaos. Money was disappearing, and they knew they needed a sharp business mind to save them from going broke. John Lennon, impressed by Klein's tough, street-smart style — he was managing the Rolling Stones — was sure Klein was the guy. George and Ringo, trusting John's gut and Klein's promises to make them more money, quickly agreed. Paul, however, was not convinced. He saw Klein as a shark, an outsider he couldn't trust. He wanted his new father-in-law, Lee Eastman, a respected New York entertainment lawyer, to handle their business. To the other three, this felt like Paul trying to bring his in-laws into the mix, and they weren't having it. This wasn't just a small disagreement. It was the crack that would legally and emotionally break the Beatles apart. Paul was outvoted 3-1. Klein was in. From that point on, Paul felt betrayed and alone. He refused to sign the management contract with Klein, which made him legally separate from the rest of the band in their business dealings. He saw everything John, George, and Ringo did as being influenced by Klein. He felt they weren't his partners anymore, but Klein's puppets. He pulled away, both physically and emotionally, spending more and more time on his farm in Scotland with his new wife, Linda, and their family. He was essentially boycotting Apple and the other Beatles. It was in this tense environment that Paul decided to move forward with his own project, a solo album he simply called McCartney. He recorded it mostly in secret, playing all the instruments himself, a clear sign of his independence. He set a release date for April 17, 1970. The problem was, the long-delayed Let It Be album was now scheduled to be released by Apple around the same time. To Klein, John, and George, this felt like sabotage. It was unthinkable for a Beatle to release a solo record that would directly compete with the band's final album. They decided Paul's album had to be pushed back. A letter was written, a formal request from the board of Apple Corp., and by extension from John, George, and Ringo, asking Paul to delay his release. Now, who was going to deliver it? Some say the first idea was to send an office worker. But Ringo, as a gesture of friendship, felt that Paul deserved to hear the news from a partner, not an errand boy. He believed that his normally good relationship with Paul would soften the blow. He thought he could be the diplomat to fix things. He couldn't have been more wrong. Paul no longer saw him as Ringo, his old friend from the Cavern Club. He saw him as a messenger for the enemy, a soldier for Alan Klein, sent to his home to bully him. As Ringo's car pulled up to Paul's house on March 31st, 1970, he was walking into an ambush he never saw coming. The scene at Paul McCartney's house in London should have been a peaceful one. Paul was at home with his family trying to escape the corporate war that had taken over his life. The arrival of Ringo Starr should have been a nice surprise, a visit from a dear friend. But the reason for the visit poisoned the air before a word was even spoken. Ringo wasn't just stopping by for a cup of tea. He was on a mission that Paul immediately saw as hostile. As Ringo later told it, he tried to deliver the message as gently as he could. He handed over the letter from his bandmates, explaining that they felt his solo album, set for release on April 17th, should be postponed to avoid clashing with the Beatles' own upcoming releases, Let It Be and the single, The Long and Winding Road. It was a business request made on behalf of the group. But Paul heard something totally different. He didn't hear the voice of Ringo, his friendly drummer. He heard the voice of Alan Klein, the man he hated, speaking through his friend. He heard the combined weight of the three other Beatles, who he felt had turned against him, telling him what to do. Paul's reaction was instant and explosive. All the frustration, betrayal, and bitterness that had been building for months erupted. Ringo watched in shock as his friend transformed. To my dismay, he went completely out of control, Starr later said in a court affidavit. This wasn't the charming, diplomatic Paul the world knew. This was a man pushed to his absolute limit. Paul started shouting, his voice rising with fury. He jabbed his finger in Ringo's face, a gesture of pure aggression. The words he spat weren't just angry, they were threatening. "I'll finish you, now," he seethed, a phrase that sounded more like something from a gangster movie than a fight between musicians. "You'll pay," he added, the words hanging in the air. For Ringo, a man known for his calm personality and his desire to keep the peace, it was a deeply shocking and scary experience. He'd seen arguments in the band before, but this was different. This was personal. It was vicious. And it was happening in Paul's own home. Paul himself later admitted to his hostile reaction, saying it was the only time he'd ever thrown someone out of his house. He remembered feeling completely fed up and cornered. He said, "I must say I gave him a bit of verbal. I said, 'You guys are just messing me around.'" When Ringo tried to explain it was a decision on behalf of the board, it only made Paul angrier. To Paul, Ringo was no longer a friend, but a fall guy, the gentle messenger sent to do the other's dirty work. The breaking point was reached. Paul screamed at Ringo to put his coat on and get out. A stunned Ringo did exactly what he was told. He put on his coat and left, the threats ringing in his ears. He had gone there hoping to be a peacemaker, but instead he'd been verbally attacked and thrown out by a man he saw as a brother. The fight had a grievous effect on their friendship, a deep wound that wouldn't heal easily. In that moment, the business fights and legal battles of the Beatles' breakup became terrifyingly real. It wasn't just about contracts and release dates anymore. It was about raw, explosive emotion and the horrifying realization that the bond that once seemed so unbreakable was now truly, permanently shattered. The drive away from Paul McCartney's house must have been a quiet one for Ringo Starr. The angry words and the raw threats signaled an ending far uglier than he could have imagined. The incident wasn't just a private fight, it became a piece of evidence in the legal battle that followed. When Paul sued to formally dissolve the Beatles' partnership later that year, Ringo's sworn statement about the confrontation was submitted to the court, making their private battle a public record. The brotherhood was now a legal dispute, with friends testifying against each other. For Ringo, this level of personal hatred was hard to handle. He was a musician, not a lawyer. While John and Paul would fight a very public war of words in the press and in their lyrics, Ringo's response was quieter and more thoughtful. He channeled his feelings into a song, a rare composition for him. Released in April 1971 as the B-side to his hit single It Don't Come Easy, the track was titled Early 1970. It was like a musical open letter about his relationships with his three former bandmates. The song's first verse is aimed right at Paul. With a gentle, almost cheerful tune, Ringo paints a picture of Paul's new life as a quiet country gentleman. Lives on a farm, got plenty of charm, beep, beep, he sings. He's got no cows, but he's sure got a whole lot of sheep and a brand new wife and a family. It's both affectionate and a little teasing. But then comes the line that reveals the deep hurt left by their fight. And when he comes to town, I wonder if he'll play with me. It's a question full of sadness. After everything they had been through, Ringo was genuinely unsure if his old friend would ever play music with him again. The rest of the song shows his confidence in the others. Of John Lennon and Yoko Ono, he sings about their primal scream. Therapy, concluding, and when he comes to town, I know he's going to play with me. He's just as sure about his continued friendship with George Harrison. Only Paul is a question mark. Still, the song isn't an attack. Some have called it a rough draft of a peace treaty. It ends with Ringo making fun of his own limited skills, on guitar and piano, and a final hopeful plea. And when I go to town, I want to see all three. It was Ringo's way of saying that despite the anger and the threats, what he really wanted was to make up. In the years that followed, time began to heal the deep wounds. Ringo and Paul's friendship, though badly damaged, was not destroyed. They started working together again, with Paul playing on several of Ringo's solo albums. After Ringo's first wife Maureen passed away, Paul wrote the song Little Willow for her, a beautiful and heartfelt gesture for his old friend. Today, their relationship is one of warm, brotherly love. They are the last two remaining Beatles, the only two people on Earth who can truly share those memories. They talk about each other with deep respect and love. Ringo has called Paul the brother I never had, while Paul has called Ringo his best pal. Their bond today shows that even the ugliest moments can fade, and that the love they formed as young men was ultimately strong enough to survive the storm of their breakup. The story of Ringo and Paul is a powerful reminder that even in the most famous bands, the relationships are deeply human, full of love, complexity, and sometimes intense conflict. It shows how immense pressure can push even the strongest friendships to their breaking point. What do you think about this explosive chapter in the Beatles' history? Did Paul overreact, or was his anger justified given the circumstances? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into a lesser-known corner of music history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories you won't find anywhere else. In the end, the idea that Ringo Starr truly hated Paul McCartney is both true and false. In that single terrifying moment in Paul's home, facing a rage he had never seen before, a feeling like hate, born of betrayal, fear, and deep sadness, was surely there. It was the kind of hurt you can only feel for a family member who has wounded you deeply. The fight was the ugliest moment of the Beatles' breakup, a time when business arguments turned into personal threats. But a lasting, all-consuming hatred? That was never Ringo's style. His response wasn't a bitter attack song like John Lennon's How Do You Sleep? Instead, it was Early 1970, a song filled with sadness and a desire to reconnect. Ringo was and has always been the heart of the Beatles, the one who always chose peace and love. The explosive fight with Paul wasn't the final word on their relationship, but its lowest point. From there, they slowly and carefully rebuilt their friendship. Today, as the last two survivors of that incredible journey, their bond seems stronger and more precious than ever. They are living history, two old friends who share something no one else can understand. Their story shows that even the most beloved band in the world was made up of real human beings, capable of incredible creativity and love, but also of anger, paranoia, and the kind of pain that only brothers can inflict on one another. And ultimately, it's a story of forgiveness, proving that the love they shared was, in the end, strong enough to get them back to where they once belonged.